They took the house first. In their heads, before the lawyer even opened the folder, they took the boat next, and the pension, and the name on the mailbox. Preston Sutton stood up at the head of that conference table and called his father's widow a freeloader, right out loud, right in front of the family lawyer, like it was the weather report. "She's not family," he said. "She's a freeloader who married in for the pension." His wife nodded along like it was scripture. Marlene Sutton did not raise her voice. She folded her hands on a closed folder, one she had not let anyone touch in 8 months, and she said 4 words. "That's fine, Preston." Then a naval officer knocked on that same door 2 weeks later. He stood at attention. He asked the room a single question. It made Preston Sutton's coffee cup stop halfway to his mouth. "Which one of you is the Admiral?" Nobody answered right away, because nobody in that room, except Marlene, knew what he meant. 3 hours before the will reading, before everything fell apart, there was just a woman making coffee in a kitchen that still smelled like her husband's aftershave. "My name is Marlene Sutton. I am 63 years old. I did not raise my voice that morning. I did not raise it 2 weeks later either. Most people mistake a quiet woman for an empty one. That mistake usually costs them. Everett had been gone 8 months. A stroke. Quick, in his sleep. The kind of death people call peaceful because it lets them avoid saying anything else about it. I had been married to him for 11 years. 11 years of learning to read a chart the way he read one. Correcting a bearing without looking twice. Sitting at his kitchen table while he explained what a survivor benefit plan was, and why it mattered more than any ring he'd ever given me. I never once corrected anyone who assumed I was just the second wife. Let them assume. Assumptions are cheap. Paper is not. Preston was Everett's son from his first marriage. 39 years old, a boat broker down in Charleston. The kind of man who wore a captain's hat he'd never earned, to sell yachts to men who had. He came to see his father maybe 4 times in 11 years. Christmas some years. Never a phone call in between that wasn't about money. I didn't know, that morning, standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold, that Preston was $210,000 underwater, on a loan against a boat brokerage that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years. I didn't know he'd already promised his lender the lake house. Our lake house. The one his father built with his own hands after 2 overseas deployments. Collateral, the moment probate closed. I found all of that out later. What I knew that morning was simpler. Everett had left me a letter, sealed, inside a steel box at the bank. He had told me only one thing about it before he died. "If Preston ever calls you a guest in this house, open the box." I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't think I'd need to. The law office was 3 blocks off Bay Street, in Beaufort, South Carolina. The kind of low-country town where the Spanish moss hangs over the sidewalks like it's listening. Everett had chosen this town when he retired. Close enough to the Marine Corps air station that he could still hear the jets some mornings. Close enough to the water that he could keep a small boat at the public dock and pretend he wasn't as old as his knees told him he was. Mr. Aldous Faircloth had been the family lawyer for 18 years, a soft-spoken man who wore reading glasses on a chain and never rushed anything. He set the folder on the table, unopened, and waited for everyone to sit. Preston sat at the head, like he already owned the chair. His wife Dana sat beside him in a blazer too sharp for a Tuesday morning. I sat across from them, in the same chair I'd sat in for every family gathering for 11 years. The one nobody ever offered to move me from, because nobody ever thought I'd stay long enough to matter. Before Mr. Faircloth had even lifted the folder's cover, Preston stood up. "Before we start," he said, "I want it on the record. She's not family. She's a freeloader who married in for the pension. The room went the kind of quiet that has a texture to it. Dana nodded, slow, like she'd rehearsed the nod in a mirror. I looked at Preston for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to notice I wasn't flinching. I set my hands flat on the closed folder in front of me, the one I'd carried in myself, the one with Everett's handwriting on the tab. I did not open it. "That's fine, Preston," I said. That was all. He looked almost disappointed I hadn't given him more to work with. Mr. Faircloth cleared his throat and opened the will. It was mostly what everyone expected. The house on Bramlett Road went into a family trust, administered jointly, pending review. The boat went to Preston outright. A small mercy from a father to a son who never once helped maintain it. A modest cash sum was split between 2 grandchildren I'd never met. Preston's kids from a marriage before Dana, kids he rarely mentioned. Then there was a line near the bottom that made Preston's jaw tighten. "The trustee of the Sutton Maritime Trust," Mr. Faircloth read, "shall be Marlene A. Sutton, in perpetuity, with all rights and responsibilities as previously executed and notarized." "What trust?" Preston said. "There's no trust. Dad didn't have a trust." Mr. Faircloth adjusted his glasses. "It appears he did, Preston. Filed and sealed 14 months ago." Preston's eyes cut to me. I kept my hands flat on my own folder and said nothing. Let him wonder. Wondering was free. I intended to let him spend a great deal of it. "That's clerical," Preston said too fast. "That's a typo. M. Sutton. That's probably supposed to be me." Preston Sutton. "The document specifies Marlene," Mr. Faircloth said gently. "The way you tell a man his shoe is untied. First name, in full, on page 3. Preston didn't ask to see page 3. That told me something. A man certain he was right would have looked. A man afraid of what he'd find would rather argue with the lawyer than read the paper. I filed that away the way Everett taught me to file everything. Quietly, precisely. For later. The meeting ended without warmth. Dana didn't say goodbye. Preston shook Mr. Faircloth's hand and ignored mine entirely, which was, honestly, a mercy. I drove home along the river road with the windows down, past the low white houses, past the shrimp boats tied up for the afternoon. I did not cry. I had done my crying 8 months earlier, alone, in a hospital hallway, where nobody was keeping score. I want to go back further, because the freeloader line didn't start in that conference room. It started years before, in small comments dropped like loose change. Preston used to say things at Thanksgiving. "Dad, you sure you don't want a prenup renegotiation just to protect the estate?" He'd laugh like it was a joke and watch my face while he said it. He used to ask Everett, in front of me, whether I understood military benefits or whether he should walk her through it sometime. Everett never let those comments land soft. He'd set his fork down. He'd say, "Marlene runs this house better than the Navy ran half its ships." Then he'd go back to eating, and Preston would go quiet for the rest of the meal. But Everett wasn't at the table anymore to say things like that. And Preston knew it. What Preston didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent 11 years learning things a second wife supposedly has no business learning. Everett used to spread charts across the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, old ones from his active duty years, just for the pleasure of teaching someone who wanted to learn. I could read a compass rose before I could parallel park in this town. I knew what a survivor benefit plan protected and what it didn't. I knew the difference between a revocable trust and one that couldn't be touched by anybody's lawyer, not even a good one. Everett had made sure of that. Patiently, deliberately, the way he'd once trained young officers who didn't yet know they were being trained. I also knew, because Everett told me plainly the year before he died, that Preston had come to him once, quietly, asking for a loan. $40,000 for what Preston called a bridge to cover a shortfall at the brokerage. Everett had said no. He told me that night, sitting on the porch with 2 fingers of bourbon he wasn't supposed to be drinking. That boy's in over his head. He thinks a boat with someone else's name on it is going to save him. I won't put a rope around his neck by handing him more line. I didn't know then how right he was. I would find out exactly how right. $210,000 later. There is one particular Sunday I keep returning to. The way you return to a photograph that only later reveals what was standing just outside the frame. It was maybe 4 years into the marriage. Early spring. The kind of morning where the fog off the river hadn't burned away yet by the time Everett had the coffee going. He'd spread 3 charts across the kitchen table, old ones. Harbor approaches from a deployment he rarely discussed. He was quizzing me the way he quizzed young officers, gentle but relentless. "Tell me the bearing," he said, tapping a spot on the chart with 2 fingers. I studied it for a moment. The compass rose, the scale marks, the faint pencil notations in a hand that wasn't his. 240, maybe 245. 242, he said. Close enough to get you home. That's the only standard that matters out there. Close enough to get you home. Preston called that same morning, one of his rare calls. Everett put the phone on speaker without thinking twice about it. Privacy had never been something either of us guarded carefully from each other. "Dad, you around this weekend?" Preston's voice, tinny through the small speaker. "I want to talk about maybe restructuring some of the brokerage financing. Might need you to look something over." "I'm here," Everett said. "Come by Sunday. Bring the paperwork." "Actually," Preston said. There was a pause I didn't understand at the time. A pause I would understand perfectly, 14 months after Everett's death. "It might be easier if you just signed where I mark it. Save you reading through all the legal language." Everett's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The particular tension he reserved for people trying to move faster than he was willing to move. "Preston," he said, "I've read every page of every contract I've ever signed since I was 22 years old. That's not changing because you'd find it more convenient." Preston laughed it off, said something about Dad always being so careful. He hung up a few minutes later without setting a firm date. Everett looked at me across the charts for a long moment afterward. "He's going to ask me to sign something someday I shouldn't sign," Everett said. Quiet, more to himself than to me. "I hope I'm sharp enough, when the day comes, to tell the difference." I didn't think much of it at the time. It was one comment among thousands in a marriage full of small observations that only later revealed their full weight. But I understood, sitting in that bank room over a year after his death, reading his letter for the first time, exactly what he'd done. Everett had spent his final working year making absolutely certain he would never have to find out whether he was still sharp enough. He built the trust instead. He moved the pension designation. He locked the box. He told me exactly when to open it, because he had already seen, years in advance, exactly the moment Preston was capable of becoming. That was the thing about my husband that Preston never understood. Not once in 39 years of being his son. Everett didn't plan for the best version of the people he loved. He loved them fully, without condition. And he planned, quietly and thoroughly, for whichever version actually showed up. That evening, after the will reading, I drove to the bank instead of home. First National on Carteret Street. The branch where Everett had kept a safe deposit box since before I met him. The manager, a soft-featured man named Gerald Voss who'd known Everett for a decade, walked me back himself. "Captain Sutton left instructions," Gerald said, sliding the long steel box onto the little table in the private room. Said if you ever came in alone, no appointment needed. Ever. I sat there for a moment with my hand flat on the lid, the same way I'd kept my hand flat on that folder in the lawyer's office. Two closed things in one day. I was getting good at not opening things until I was ready. Not today, Gerald, I said. I'm not ready yet. He nodded, like that made perfect sense to him, which told me Everett had prepared him for that answer too. I drove home in the dark, past the church Everett and I had been married in 11 years earlier, past the marina where his boat still sat under a blue tarp nobody had touched since the funeral. I let myself think, for the first time since the reading, about the word Preston had used. Freeloader. I had heard worse words aimed at better people, but that one had a particular shape to it, because it assumed I had taken something from a family that never once let me sit at its center. I had not taken anything. I had built a life beside a man who chose me, deliberately, with his eyes open. I had earned every quiet hour of it. Preston wanted to believe I'd slipped in through a side door. He had no idea his own father had built me a door of my own. My name carved into the frame, years before Preston ever thought to ask what was inside. I went to bed that night without opening the box and without touching the folder. Some doors open better on their own schedule. I have learned that much. Mine was coming. I could feel it the way you feel weather 2 days out. A pressure in the air that has not yet decided to become a storm. Preston, I would learn later, spent that same night on the phone with his lender, promising the lake house as collateral before the ink on his own father's will was even dry. He had no idea what the word Admiral meant yet either. Neither of us did, not fully, but one of us was about to find out, and it would not be me who got the surprise. I went back to the bank 3 days later on a Thursday morning, after I had slept enough nights on it to feel steady. Gerald walked me back to the same small room. He set the same steel box on the table. This time he didn't ask if I was ready. He just left the room and closed the door soft behind him, the way you close a door on someone you respect. Inside the box was a single sealed envelope, cream-colored. My name written across the front in Everett's careful block capitals. The same hand he used to label his charts. Under the envelope, a thinner folder. Under that, a small brass keepsake box I recognized immediately. It had sat on his dresser for 11 years. I had never once asked what was inside it. Some things in a marriage you let a man keep to himself. I opened the letter first. Marlene, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone. And Preston has said something he shouldn't have. I know my son. I have loved him since the day he was born. I have watched him become a man who mistakes volume for command, the way plenty of men his age do. I did not raise him well enough on that point. That is my failure, not yours. I did not marry you for company, though you gave me plenty of that. I married you because you learned to read a chart in 6 months when it took most junior officers a year, because you never once needed me to explain something twice. I have spent 30 years training people to be quietly excellent. You were the best student I ever had who didn't wear a uniform. The trust is real. It is irrevocable. It holds the salvage rights I spent a decade building, the ones from 2 recovery contracts off the Carolina coast, worth considerably more than this house and everything in it combined. It is yours, in full, to administer as you see fit, including for Preston's children, if you choose. Though I leave that entirely to your judgment, not his. One more thing. There is a name I used for you in my personal log, the one I kept every deployment and never let anyone read, including you. The men who served under me will know it. If Preston ever calls you a guest in this house, or anything less than what you are, show them the log. Or better yet, let them find out on their own. You always did prefer to let the truth do the talking. I loved you the entire time, not in spite of anything, because of everything. Everett, I sat in that small bank room for a long while after I finished reading. I did not cry, not because I was made of anything harder than any other widow, because Everett had never liked drama, even from the grave, and I intended to honor that. The thinner folder held copies of the trust documents, notarized, dated 14 months before his death. Exactly as Mr. Faircloth had said, the brass keepsake box held a single item, a worn leather logbook, Navy issue, the cover soft from 30 years of handling. I opened it to the last page he had written, dated the week before his stroke. Called the Admiral this morning to ask what she thought about the Bramlett Road roof. She was right, as always. Told her once, years back, that she ran a tighter ship than half the officers I commanded, and she laughed it off like I was joking. I wasn't. If anyone in this family ever forgets who is actually in command of this house, they can ask around. Someone will remember the name. The Admiral. I sat with that word for a long time. Turning it over the way you turn over a stone you have stepped past 100 times without noticing its shape. Everett had never called me that to my face. Not once. He had saved it for the pages nobody else was supposed to read. I called Mr. Faircloth the next morning. I asked for a referral to someone who understood maritime trusts specifically. The language in mine went beyond anything a general estate lawyer usually handled. He gave me a name, a woman named Corinne Ashby, a small firm in Charleston that specialized in exactly this kind of thing. Corinne Ashby had a corner office 2 floors above a coffee shop on King Street. Stacks of paper organized with a precision I recognized immediately because it matched my own. She read through the trust documents for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Then she looked up at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Sutton, do you understand what your husband actually built here?" "I understand it's a trust," I said. "I understand it involves salvage rights. It's more than that." She turned the folder around so I could see the page she had flagged. "Your husband held recovery rights on 2 commercial shipwreck sites off the Carolina coast, both confirmed and licensed through the Federal Maritime Authority. One of them has already produced verified recoveries valued at just under $4 million. The trust holds exclusive rights to the second site, which has not even been fully surveyed yet." I did not say anything for a moment. $4 million is not a number that arrives gently. "The house Preston is fighting you over," Corinne said, not unkindly, "is worth perhaps $300,000 on a good day. He has no idea what he's actually losing by trying to remove you from it." "He doesn't know about the trust," I said. "Not really. He thinks it's a clerical error." "Then I would suggest," Corinne said, closing the folder gently, "that you let him keep thinking that a little while longer. Men who believe they've already won tend to make mistakes men who are still fighting don't make." I liked Corinne Ashby immediately. She had Everett's habit of saying exactly what needed saying and nothing more. It was in that same meeting, going through the estate's financial paperwork line by line, that Corinne found the second thing. She held up a photocopy of a boat brokerage loan document, a personal guarantee. Everett Sutton's signature at the bottom. "This is dated 14 months ago," she said slowly. "4 months after your husband's stroke." Something went still and cold in my chest. Not shock exactly. Recognition, arriving early. Everett couldn't sign anything 4 months after his stroke. He could barely hold a pen. I fed him breakfast that whole spring. "Then someone signed this for him," Corinne said. "Or signed it as him. Preston's loan. $210,000. co-signed in his father's name. On a document dated well after Everett had lost the physical ability to write his own signature legibly, let alone execute a personal guarantee on a business loan. I had watched Everett's hand shake so badly that spring, he couldn't sign a birthday card for his granddaughter. There was no version of the man I nursed for those 4 months who could have signed anything resembling the tight, steady signature on that page. I want you to make copies of everything, I told Corinne. Everything. The trust, the letter, this loan document, all of it. And I want you to tell me, honestly, what happens to a man who forges his dying father's signature on a loan guarantee? Depending on the amount and the lender, Corinne said, it can rise to federal wire fraud. If the loan crossed state lines electronically, which most brokerage loans do, that is not a civil matter anymore, Mrs. Sutton. That is the kind of thing a federal auditor gets involved in. I thought about Preston standing at the head of that conference table, calling me a freeloader before the folder was even open. I thought about 11 years of small comments dropped like loose change, about being told to sit in the same chair every holiday because nobody expected me to matter. I felt, for one brief moment, the pull of something sharp and satisfying. The urge to walk into his office and lay that photocopy on his desk myself. I did not do that. Everett had married a woman who understood the difference between anger and action. I intended to keep being that woman. I'm not going to report it today, I told Corinne. Not yet. Let's see what he does next. A man that far underwater usually finds a way to drown himself without any help from me. Corinne studied me for a moment, the way Everett used to study a chart before committing to a course. Your husband called you the Admiral, she said. I read that line in the logbook copy you gave me. I understand it now. I didn't answer that. Some things you let stand on their own, without decoration. I drove home that evening with the copies locked in a folder on the passenger seat. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something other than grief sitting in my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. Something closer to patience, finally finding its purpose. 2 days later, Preston's lawyer filed a petition. I read it standing at my own kitchen counter, the same counter where Everett used to spread his charts on Sunday mornings. The petition claimed I was a non-blood beneficiary of questionable mental competency to administer complex financial instruments. It requested an emergency hearing to have the Sutton Maritime Trust placed under third-party guardianship, pending review. Preston wanted a stranger to run the trust instead of me, a stranger he could work far more easily than he could ever work his father's widow. I read the petition twice. I folded it neatly. I set it beside Everett's letter on the kitchen table. 2 documents, side by side. One from a man who spent 30 years teaching people to be quietly excellent. One from his son, who apparently never learned the lesson. The hearing was set for 2.5 weeks out. 3 days before it, the base chaplain from the air station called my house. A soft-voiced man named Chaplain Dooley who had known Everett for years. He told me something that stopped me in the middle of my own kitchen. Mrs. Sutton, he said. One of Captain Sutton's old officers reached out to me. Commander Alan Reyes. He heard through the chaplain's network that the captain's widow was being pushed out of her own home. He asked if there was a memorial detail coming up he could attend. Said he owed your husband something he never got to pay back. I stood there holding the phone, looking at the letter still sitting on my kitchen table, at the word Admiral written in my husband's careful hand. I felt for the first time in 8 months something that was almost hope. There's a flag detail at the National Cemetery in 2 weeks, I said, for one of Everett's old sailors. Tell the commander he's welcome. I had no idea, hanging up that phone, just how much weight Commander Reyes intended to bring with him. Preston called me the next morning. That surprised me. because Preston had never once called just to talk. He wanted to know why I hadn't responded to the guardianship petition yet. "You've got until the hearing," he said, his voice doing that thing men do when they're trying to sound reasonable and generous at the same time. "This isn't personal, Marlene. It's just cleaner this way. A neutral third party manages the trust. Everybody avoids a mess. You keep living in the house as long as you need to." "As long as I need to," I repeated back to him. Flat. "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean, Preston." There was a pause on the line, the kind where a man senses he has said something he cannot quite take back, but isn't sure yet what it was. "Look," he said, softer. "Dad would have wanted this handled without drama. A stranger running the trust is fair to everyone, even you." I thought about the letter on my kitchen table, about a man who spent 30 years training officers to be quietly excellent, telling me plainly that the trust was mine, in perpetuity, with all rights and responsibilities as previously executed and notarized. I thought about how certain Preston sounded, and how certainty, in my experience, is usually loudest right before it breaks. "I appreciate the call, Preston," I said, and hung up before he could say anything else. Dana came by the house 2 days later, alone. That was unusual enough that I nearly didn't recognize her car in the driveway. She stood on the porch in a cardigan instead of a blazer, looking younger and more tired than she had at the will reading. "I wanted to come by myself," she said. "Preston doesn't know I'm here." I let her in and made coffee. Whatever she'd come to say, I intended to hear it sitting down, not standing at the door like a stranger. "He's scared," Dana said, wrapping her hands around the mug without drinking from it. "The brokerage is in worse shape than he's told anyone. I found out by accident, going through his email. There's a loan, a big one, and I think he did something with Everett's name on it. I don't know the details. I just know he's been different since it came due." I said nothing. I already knew. Dana clearly did not know how much I knew, and I did not intend to tell her yet. "I'm not saying this to defend him," she said. "I'm saying it because I think he's about to do something he can't undo. I don't want to be standing next to him when it happens." "Why are you telling me this, Dana?" She looked down at the coffee. "Because Everett was kind to me. Every holiday, when Preston was busy being Preston, your husband used to ask me how I was really doing. Nobody else in that family ever asked me that. I owe him something for it. Maybe I owe it to you instead, now." I studied her for a long moment. 11 years of family gatherings, and this was the first real conversation Dana and I had ever had. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I mean that." She left without finishing her coffee. I stood at the window and watched her car pull out of the driveway. I thought about how strange it is that the people closest to a lie are sometimes the first to feel its weight shift. The days leading up to the hearing moved slowly, the way days do when you know something is coming, but not exactly when. I spent them the way Everett had trained me to spend difficult stretches of time, methodically. I met with Corinne Ashby twice more. We built a file, thick and organized, the trust documents on top, the loan forgery beneath it. A timeline of Everett's medical decline, cross-referenced against the loan's execution date, notarized by a doctor's letter confirming he had lost fine motor function months before the signature was supposedly made. "You understand," Corinne said at our second meeting, "that once this file leaves this office, you can't control where it goes. If we present the medical timeline at the guardianship hearing to prove your competency, the loan forgery comes out with it. There's no version of this where Preston doesn't find out you know." "I understand," I said. "And you're still choosing to wait." "I'm choosing to let him walk all the way out onto the ice before anyone tells him it's thin." I said. He's been walking toward it for 2 years. I'm not going to be the one who stops him 3 feet short. Corinne almost smiled at that. For a woman as composed as she was, it counted as a full laugh. 2 nights before the hearing, I finally called Commander Reyes myself. I wanted to hear his voice before I saw his face, the way Everett always said you should, before trusting a man with anything important. He answered on the second ring. Formal, careful. Mrs. Sutton, thank you for taking my call. Chaplain Dooley says you served under my husband. Executive officer, his last 2 deployments, Reyes said. Captain Sutton is the reason I made it to commander at all. He put my name forward for a promotion board when 3 other officers wanted to bury it. I never got the chance to thank him properly before he passed. He didn't tell me much about his work toward the end, I said. He kept a lot of it in a logbook I only just found. There was a pause on the line. Ma'am, if I may ask, did the logbook mention a nickname? My hand tightened slightly on the phone. It did. Then I imagine you already understand more than most people in your family do, Reyes said. Captain Sutton used that name in briefings, Mrs. Sutton, not as a joke. He'd say, if you want to know how a real command runs, go home and watch my wife handle a Tuesday. He said it enough times that half my old unit knows the name, even if they never met you. I sat with that for a moment. In my kitchen, at the same table where Everett used to spread his charts. There's a flag detail at the National Cemetery, I said. 2 weeks out for one of his old sailors. I understand you're planning to attend. I am, ma'am. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to say something to the family while I'm there. Nothing dramatic, just the truth, spoken out loud, the way the captain would have wanted it said eventually. Say whatever you need to say, Commander, I told him. I've spent 11 years letting the truth wait its turn. I think it's earned a little airtime. The guardianship hearing itself, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic, which I suspect is exactly how Corinne had planned it. Preston's lawyer argued that I was a non-blood beneficiary with no documented financial or maritime expertise, unqualified to manage a complex trust of this size. Corinne responded by entering, calmly, one piece of evidence at a time. The trust documents, notarized 14 months before Everett's death, naming me trustee explicitly by full name. A letter from Everett's cardiologist confirming the severity and timing of his stroke, including a note on his loss of fine motor control by March of that year. And finally, almost as an afterthought, a certified copy of the boat brokerage loan guarantee, dated 4 months after that stroke, bearing Everett Sutton's signature. The judge, a measured woman named Hollis Whitfield, who had clearly seen every version of family greed a small-town courtroom could produce, studied the trust documents and the medical letter for a long moment. Then she looked up at Preston's lawyer. Counsel, your petition rests entirely on the claim that Mrs. Sutton lacks the competency to manage a complex financial instrument. I'm looking at 14 months of notarized paperwork that says her husband disagreed with you rather thoroughly before he died. Preston's lawyer shifted in his seat. Your Honor, the family simply believes an independent professional trustee would better serve. The family, Judge Whitfield said, is not the petitioner named on this document. Mr. Preston Sutton is. She turned a page, unhurried. I'm denying the guardianship petition. The trust remains under Mrs. Sutton's sole administration, exactly as her late husband executed it. Preston's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Corinne had made the deliberate choice not to introduce the loan document that day. We had it. We had the doctor's letter timing his stroke to the month. We had everything we needed to end him in that room, in front of a judge who would have listened. I asked her to hold it back anyway. You could have finished it today, Corinne said quietly, as we packed up the folder afterward, out in the hallway. the forgery, the timeline, all of it. Judge Whitfield would have referred it to federal review on the spot. I know, I said. Then why wait? I thought about Everett's letter, still sitting on my kitchen table. About a man who preferred to let the truth arrive on its own schedule rather than force it. Because there's a flag detail in 11 days, I said. I think Everett would rather his son hear the whole truth once, in front of people who actually knew him, not delivered in pieces by a judge who never did. Corinne studied me for a moment. You're building towards something specific. I'm letting a dead man finish a sentence he started 14 months ago, I said. I'm just choosing where he gets to say it. Preston caught up to me in the courthouse parking lot. Alone, his lawyer already gone. He looked smaller out there under the open sky than he had at the head of that conference table 3 weeks earlier. You knew, he said. About the trust, the whole time. I knew what your father told me, I said, which was considerably more than he told you, apparently. That's not what I mean. His voice cracked slightly. A hairline fracture in all that certainty. The loan. You know about the loan. I looked at him for a long moment. The way Everett used to look at a chart before deciding whether to correct a young officer's course himself, or let the current teach the lesson instead. I know a great many things, Preston, I said. I've known most of them for 2 weeks. You've had 14 months to fix the one thing that actually matters. You spent it calling me a freeloader instead. I left him standing in that parking lot. I did not look back to see his face. Some men need to sit alone with a question before they're ready to hear the answer. The 11 days between the hearing and the flag detail passed, the way calm water passes over a reef nobody's charted yet. Quiet on the surface, everything moving underneath. Dana called me twice that week. Careful, brief calls. The kind you make when you're not sure whose side you're supposed to be on anymore. She told me Preston had stopped sleeping, that he'd started making calls late at night to people at the brokerage, trying to restructure the loan before anyone official came asking questions about it. She told me, on the second call, that she'd started sleeping in the guest room. I'm not leaving him, she said. Not yet. But I needed you to know I'm not defending what he did either. Not anymore. I appreciate you telling me, I said. I mean it, Dana. Everett really did call you the Admiral, she said. It wasn't a question. Preston mentioned it the night after the hearing. He found some old requisition form in his father's desk, years back, with the word written on it in the margin. He always thought it was a joke, some Navy thing he didn't understand. It wasn't a joke, I said. I'm starting to understand that, Dana said, and hung up before either of us had to say anything else. I spent those 11 days the way I'd spent most of the 11 years before them. Quietly. Precisely. I met with Corinne twice more, finalizing the paperwork that would formalize my role as sole trustee beyond any future challenge. I visited the second salvage site's survey documents, just to understand in full what Everett had actually built for me. $4 million confirmed, a second site that could double it. Numbers so large they'd stopped feeling personal to me and started feeling like a responsibility instead. The kind Everett used to describe when he talked about command. I also, on the 9th day, did something I had not planned to do. I drove out to the marina and pulled the blue tarp off Everett's boat for the first time since the funeral. It was smaller than I remembered. A modest 22-foot cabin cruiser he'd named the Second Watch, a joke about second marriages that only the two of us had ever found funny. I sat in the captain's chair for a long while, not going anywhere, just sitting, my hand on a wheel that still smelled faintly of the marine oil he used to condition it every spring. I thought about the word freeloader again, turning it over one more time. testing whether it still had any weight left to it. It didn't. A freeloader takes without giving anything back. I had given Everett 11 years of attention, patience, and the kind of steady presence a dying man's family too often forgets to offer. He had given me a trust worth more than his son would ever understand, and something more valuable than the money. He had given me a name, not Sutton, though I'd earned that too. The other one, the one that meant somebody, somewhere, had finally seen exactly what I was capable of, and had said so, in writing, in a place he thought no one but her would ever read. I turned the boat's small outboard motor a few times, just to hear it turn over. Then I put the tarp back exactly the way it had been. Some things you're not ready to use yet, even when you've decided you're keeping them. Commander Reyes called twice more that week, coordinating logistics for the flag detail, asking careful, respectful questions about how much I wanted said and how much I wanted left unsaid. I don't want a spectacle, Commander, I told him during the second call. Everett never liked spectacle. He liked precision. Understood, ma'am, Reyes said. I'll keep it precise. I just ask you to trust me on the timing. I trust the man who trained you, I said. That's close enough. He laughed once, warm and quick. He'd have liked that answer. Preston, meanwhile, according to what I pieced together later from Dana and from a brief, tense email his lawyer sent Corinne, had spent those 11 days trying, unsuccessfully, to quietly renegotiate the boat loan, before anyone official started asking why a dead man's signature appeared on a document dated 4 months after his stroke. His lender wasn't interested in renegotiating anything. His lender wanted the collateral or the balance or an explanation, in that order. Preston had none of the three. I did not reach out to warn him. Everett used to say that the kindest thing you can do for a man circling a mistake is let him finish the circle himself. A rescue he doesn't understand teaches him nothing. A consequence he earns teaches him everything. I had learned a great deal from my husband over 11 years. That particular lesson I intended to apply in full. 3 days before the flag detail, Preston called me again, this time without the careful reasonableness of the first call. His voice had an edge to it now, thin and cornered. I need you to talk to the lender, he said. Tell them the estate will cover the loan. Tell them it's a Sutton family obligation. It's not a Sutton family obligation, Preston, I said. It's a signature on a document your father was physically incapable of making. You know that. I know that. The only question left is who else finds out, and when. Silence on the line. Long enough that I could hear him breathing. You'd let them take everything, he said finally. The brokerage, the boat. Dana and I would have nothing. I'm not taking anything from you, Preston, I said. I haven't touched a single dollar of your loan, your brokerage, or your life. I simply stopped agreeing to fix a problem I never created. There's a difference. I think, if you sit with it long enough, you'll find it. This is revenge, he said. This is you punishing me for one comment at a will reading. No, I said. For the first time since that conference room, I let a small measure of iron into my voice, quiet but unmistakable. This is 11 years of being told to sit in the same chair at every holiday because nobody thought I mattered enough to move. This is your father spending 14 months building a fortress around a woman you called a freeloader. He knew, long before either of us did, exactly what kind of son you'd become the moment he stopped watching. I'm not punishing you, Preston. I'm simply done absorbing what you keep dropping. He hung up without saying anything else. I set the phone down on the counter beside Everett's letter. I noticed for the first time in 8 months that my hands were completely steady. 2 days before the flag detail, Corinne called with something I hadn't expected. A second document had surfaced. one neither of us had gone looking for. The Federal Maritime Authority flagged something while processing your trust's second site survey, she said. It's not related to the loan. It's related to the salvage rights themselves. What kind of something? There's a competing claim filed against the second site, Corinne said. Filed 8 months ago, 1 month after Everett died. My stomach tightened. By whom? By Preston, Corinne said. Through a shell entity registered to the brokerage. He's claiming the salvage rights should have passed to him as Everett's biological heir, arguing the trust designation was executed under undue influence. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. The same table where Everett used to spread his charts. The same table where I'd read his letter for the first time. 11 years, and I was still learning new things about how far this family's edges could stretch. He filed this a month after the funeral, I said, before I'd even opened the trust documents, before he ever called me a freeloader to my face. It appears so, Corinne said. He's been working 2 angles simultaneously, Mrs. Sutton. The guardianship petition on one side, hoping to install a friendlier third party, and this claim on the other, hoping to invalidate the trust designation entirely in case the guardianship route failed. I thought about the word undue influence, how strange it felt applied to a marriage I had spent 11 years building with my whole attention, my whole patience, and, in the end, my whole heart. Preston wanted a court to believe I had manipulated a dying man into signing away his son's inheritance. He had no idea the trust predated his father's stroke by months. Filed while Everett was still sharp enough to argue chart headings with harbor pilots twice his age. Can he win that claim? I asked. No, Corinne said, without hesitation. The medical timeline destroys it before it starts. But it tells you something important. He's not just protecting the brokerage anymore. He's trying to seize the entire trust for himself. $4 million and rising. And he filed that claim before you'd even had a chance to grieve properly. I sat with that for a long moment. 11 years of small comments dropped like loose change had never once prepared me for the size of what Preston actually wanted. This wasn't about a house on Bramlett Road anymore, or wounded pride at a will reading. Preston had been planning to take the whole of what his father built, quietly, methodically, from the very first weeks of his father's absence, using words like undue influence to make it sound like justice instead of theft. He's been planning this since the funeral, I said quietly. It looks that way, Corinne said. Mrs. Sutton, I think it's time we stop waiting for the flag detail to say everything you need said. This claim needs to be answered formally, on the record, regardless of what happens at the cemetery. No, I said, surprising myself with how quickly the answer came. We answer it at the cemetery, in front of the people who actually knew Everett. I want Preston to hear the whole shape of what he tried to do once, all at the same time from people who can't be dismissed as bitter or biased. A courtroom gives him a lawyer to hide behind. A flag detail gives him nothing but the truth and the men who served with his father. Corinne studied me through the phone's silence for a long moment. You've thought about this a great deal. I've had 11 days, I said, and 11 years before that. I called Commander Reyes that evening and told him everything. The forged signature, the competing salvage claim, the word undue influence, and what it implied about a son who had started planning his father's erasure before the funeral flowers had wilted. Reyes was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Ma'am, I served under men who lied for promotions, men who padded reports, men who threw subordinates under review boards to save their own careers. I've seen a version of cowardice in nearly every uniform color there is. But a son filing a claim against his father's estate a month after the funeral, calling it undue influence when the man was still lucid enough to argue chart corrections. He stopped himself. I apologize, ma'am. That's not mine to be angry about. You're allowed to be angry on Everett's behalf, Commander, I said. I've been saving most of mine for exactly this occasion. Then let me ask you something, Reyes said, at the detail. When I ask the question I'm planning to ask, do you want me to stop there, or do you want the rest of it said too? I looked at Everett's letter, still sitting on my kitchen table. At the line about a name the men who served under him would recognize. At the sentence that ended with, "You always did prefer to let the truth do the talking." Say all of it, Commander, I said. Everett spent 30 years training men to speak plainly when it mattered. I think it's time somebody used that training on his behalf. The night before the flag detail, I laid out my clothes, the way I imagine Everett used to lay out his uniform before an inspection, one he intended to pass without a single note out of place. A simple navy dress, low heels I could stand in for an hour without wavering. And at the last moment, a small brooch Everett had given me on our 5th anniversary. An anchor no larger than a thumbnail, gold, worn smooth from years of handling. I had never worn it anywhere significant. I had saved it, without quite admitting to myself why, for a day that needed it more than any other day had yet. The day before the flag detail, Corinne asked me to come by her office one last time. Not for paperwork, she said, because she wanted to walk through what could happen if the day went differently than I expected. Preston could deny everything, she said, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee neither of us had touched. He could claim the commander is mistaken or exaggerating or acting on secondhand information. Family denial is a powerful thing, Mrs. Sutton. People have built entire lives on top of it. He can deny it if he wants, I said. The logbook exists whether or not he chooses to believe it. And if he tries to discredit you publicly, at the cemetery, in front of everyone, some men, cornered, come out swinging. I thought about that for a moment, turning the possibility over the way Everett had taught me to turn over any risk before committing to a course. Then he'll do that in front of a federal officer, a decorated veteran's widow, and an honor guard, I said. I don't think Preston understands even now how small a room he'd be choosing to make himself look foolish in. Corinne allowed herself a rare, small smile. You've thought this through completely. I've had a year of practice thinking things through completely, I said. Everett left me exactly enough time to learn how. She walked me to the door of her office. She paused there for a moment before I left. For what it's worth, Mrs. Sutton, in 11 years of estate law, I've represented a great many widows fighting a great many entitled children. Most of them wanted blood. You've wanted something else this entire time. What's that? Accuracy, Corinne said. You just wanted the record corrected. That's rarer than you'd think, in this line of work. I drove home from Charleston as the sun dropped low over the marsh grass along Highway 21, gold light stretching long shadows across the water on either side of the causeway. I thought about accuracy, about how strange a word it was to build a year of grief and legal maneuvering around, and how exactly right it still felt, turning it over one more time in the quiet of the car. I slept better that night than I had in 8 months. Not because I was certain of anything, because for the first time since Everett died, I understood exactly what he'd been building toward. I finally felt ready to stand where he'd left me standing. Beaufort National Cemetery sits along a quiet stretch of road outside town. Rows of white headstones running in lines so straight they look drawn with a ruler. Live oaks overhead, dripping moss onto grass kept trim by men who clearly took the work seriously. I arrived early, the way Everett always arrived early to everything. He used to say a man who shows up on time is already 10 minutes behind the men who matter. The flag detail that morning was for Petty Officer Second Class Warren Delacroix, a sailor who'd served under Everett in his final years of command. Dead 6 months now, from injuries sustained years earlier in a deployment nobody outside the Navy had ever heard of. His widow, a small composed woman named Ida Delacroix, stood near the front row of folding chairs, flanked by 2 grown children who kept a careful, protective hand near her elbow. I had never met Ida before that morning, but Everett had mentioned Warren more than once over the years, always with the particular respect he reserved for sailors who did difficult work without asking for recognition. I made my way over before the ceremony began and introduced myself. "Marlene Sutton," I said. "Everett's wife." Ida's face softened immediately. "Captain Sutton spoke about you," she said. "Warren used to say the captain talked about his wife the way most men only talk about their first command, like something he was proud to have earned." Something tightened in my chest, gentle rather than painful. The particular ache of hearing your husband praised by someone who knew a version of him you never got to see directly. Preston arrived 15 minutes later, with Dana beside him. Both of them dressed carefully, both of them clearly unaware of what the morning intended to become. Preston nodded stiffly at me across the gathering crowd, a small, cold acknowledgement, the kind 2 people exchange when neither one wants to be first to look away. I did not approach him. I had said everything I needed to say to Preston in a courthouse parking lot and over a phone line 3 days earlier. Whatever remained unsaid between us, I intended to let the day say for me. The ceremony began the way these ceremonies always do, with a solemn dignity that makes even strangers feel the particular weight of a life spent in service. A chaplain spoke briefly, a bugler played taps, the notes carrying out over the rows of white stones, settling into the moss overhead like something physical, something you could feel land on your shoulders. The honor guard performed the flag fold with the kind of precision Everett used to describe as the only kind of beauty that actually mattered. The beauty of a thing done exactly right, because it deserves nothing less. I watched Ida Delacroix receive the folded flag against her chest. I watched her children close in around her. I thought about the 8 months since Everett's own funeral, about how quickly grief teaches you to recognize its shape in other people's faces. It was near the end of the ceremony. The folded flag had been presented. The small crowd had begun the slow shuffle of standing and gathering coats. That was when Commander Alan Reyes stepped forward from the row of uniformed officers near the chapel steps. He was younger than I'd pictured from his voice on the phone, maybe 45, with the kind of bearing that made even a simple act like walking look deliberate. He climbed the 3 low steps to the small chapel platform. He turned to face the gathered crowd. He waited, silent, until every conversation in the yard had died down on its own. "Before everyone leaves," he said, his voice carrying clean across the open ground without needing to be raised, "I'd like to say a few words about Captain Everett Sutton. He isn't formally part of today's service, but he trained half the officers standing in this yard, myself included, and he deserves a moment of his own before we go." I felt my hands go still at my sides. Beside me, I sensed, rather than saw, Preston straighten. Captain Sutton commanded with a philosophy some of you may not know. Reyes continued. He used to say the best officers he ever trained were the quiet ones, not because quiet meant weak, because quiet meant a person had learned to let their work speak instead of their volume. He said the loudest man in the room is usually the one most afraid someone will notice he has nothing underneath the noise. A few soft, knowing laughs moved through the officers standing near the back. Preston did not laugh. "Captain Sutton also had a habit," Reyes said, of talking about the person who ran his household with more respect than I've heard some officers give their own executive officers. He called her a specific name, not her legal name, a name he used in briefings, in private conversations with men under his command, whenever he wanted to illustrate what real command actually looked like. The yard had gone completely still now. Even the wind seemed to be listening. "I never met her," Reyes said, until Captain Sutton was already gone. "But I promised myself, if I ever got the chance, I'd ask the question out loud, in front of the people who ought to hear the answer." He looked out over the crowd, slow and deliberate, the way a man looks when he already knows exactly where his gaze intends to land. "Which one of you," he said, "is the Admiral?" Nobody answered right away. I watched Preston's face do the arithmetic in real time, watched him remember an old requisition form found in his father's desk, a word scrawled in the margin he'd once dismissed as some Navy joke he didn't understand. I watched the exact moment it stopped being a joke. I stepped forward. "That would be me, Commander," I said. Commander Reyes came down the 3 chapel steps without hesitation. He crossed the yard at a measured pace. He stopped directly in front of me. Then he came to full attention and saluted, formal and precise, holding it a beat longer than protocol strictly required. I had been saluted exactly twice in my life, both times by mistake. Both times by young sailors who'd confused me for someone else at a base function years ago. This was neither of those things. This was a man who understood exactly who he was addressing. I did not know the proper response to a salute I had never officially earned the right to receive, so I did the only thing that felt honest. I returned it, imperfectly. My hand at an angle Everett would have gently corrected if he'd been standing there. I held it exactly as long as Reyes had held his. The yard stayed silent. Nobody laughed. Not one person. "Captain Sutton kept a private log," Reyes said, turning now to address the crowd rather than just me, "documenting 30 years of command decisions, most of them classified in one way or another. In it, he referred to his wife by a title he never once used loosely. He called her the Admiral because, in his own words, she ran a command tighter than most flag officers he'd served under. She did it without a single day of formal training, a single medal, or a single person outside this family ever bothering to notice." He turned then and looked directly at Preston. "I understand there's been some question," Reyes said, his voice still even, still without a trace of anger, about whether Mrs. Sutton earned her place in this family through undue influence. "I'd like to offer a different perspective, if the family will permit it. I've read Captain Sutton's log entries from the last 18 months of his life. He mentions his wife 41 times. He mentions his son twice. Once to say he hoped Preston would grow into the kind of man who valued people over ledgers. And once, 3 weeks before his stroke, to say he was beginning to worry that hope was misplaced." Dana made a small sound beside Preston, quickly stifled. Preston himself had gone the color of old paper. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," Reyes continued, quieter now. "I'm here because a man I respected more than almost anyone I served under taught me something, through 30 years of example. That the truth needs saying out loud eventually, in front of people who'd understand its weight. I think that time is now." He stepped back. He gave me one more measured nod. He returned to his place among the other officers. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before it. Not shocked exactly. Settled. Like something heavy had finally been set down in a room that had been carrying it a very long time. Ida Delacroix crossed the yard and took my hand in both of hers. "Warren mentioned you too," she said quietly. He said the captain's wife could read a chart better than half his junior officers. I didn't understand what that meant until just now. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than the words could carry. Preston found me near the edge of the yard as the crowd began, slowly, to disperse toward their cars. Dana stood a short distance behind him, not quite beside him anymore. Her arms crossed over her chest in a way that looked less like anger and more like someone bracing for weather. "You planned this," Preston said, low, not quite steady. "You had him say all of that, in front of everyone." "I asked him to tell the truth," I said. "I didn't write his words for him, Preston. Those were his own, and your father's, straight out of a logbook I only found 2 weeks ago. If you're angry at anyone, be angry at a man who spent 30 years documenting exactly what he thought of you, in his own hand, long before I ever opened that box." Preston's mouth worked for a moment without sound coming out. "The loan," he finally said. "Is that next? Are you going to bury me with that too?" "I'm not going to bury you with anything, Preston," I said. "I already told you. I stopped fixing problems I never created. What happens to that loan now has nothing to do with me. It has to do with a federal auditor who's going to look at a signature dated 4 months after your father lost the ability to hold a pen and draw his own conclusions." "You could stop it," Preston said. "You could make it go away." "I could," I agreed. "I'm choosing not to. There's a difference between mercy and rescue, Preston. Mercy is something I might still offer you someday if you ever become a man who deserves it. Rescue is something I stopped offering the day you called me a freeloader in front of your father's lawyer, before his body had even finished settling into whatever peace it found." I turned and walked back toward my car, past the rows of white headstones standing at their perfect, patient attention. I did not look back to see whether Preston was still standing there. Everett had taught me, in 11 quiet years, exactly which moments deserved a backward glance, and which ones did not. This was not one of them. Ida Delacroix found me by my car a moment later, before I could pull out of the lot. She squeezed my hand once, said nothing about what she'd just witnessed, and simply told me to drive safe. Some kindnesses need no explanation attached to them. Hers was one. I want to be honest about what came after. The flag detail, as much as it settled something in me, did not end anything. It only confirmed, out loud, in front of witnesses, what I had already known sitting alone in that bank room 3 weeks earlier. Preston still had a forged signature attached to a $210,000 loan. The Federal Maritime Authority still had a fraudulent competing claim filed against my trust, submitted a month after Everett's funeral, and a courtroom recognition, however satisfying, does not on its own close a federal fraud file. That work took another 6 weeks, longer than the salute, quieter than the cemetery, considerably less cinematic than anything Reyes had said that morning. But it mattered more in the end. It was the part that actually closed the door Preston had spent 14 months trying to force open. Corinne filed the full evidentiary package with the Federal Maritime Authority 2 days after the flag detail. At my direction, once I'd decided the truth had finally had enough time to breathe in public before it needed to start doing formal work. The package included the forged loan signature, the medical timeline documenting Everett's stroke and subsequent loss of fine motor control, and, as a corroborating document, a certified transcript of Commander Reyes's remarks at the cemetery, offered not as legal evidence exactly, but as context establishing the trust's legitimate, long-standing designation. A federal auditor named Patricia Loomis called Corinne's office within a week, requesting the original loan documents and a formal statement from Everett's cardiologist. 2 weeks after that, the brokerage's lender initiated its own internal review, having been notified that the personal guarantee underlying Preston's loan was under federal fraud investigation. Preston lost the brokerage entirely by the 5th week, not because I moved against him directly, because a business built on a fraudulent $210,000 guarantee cannot survive the guarantee's collapse. The lender called the loan due in full. Preston had no way to cover it. No father left to ask. No wife left willing to co-sign anything on his behalf. Dana moved out during the 4th week, taking a small apartment near her sister in Charleston. She told me, in the last phone call we had for some time, that she still believed Everett had been kind to her. She intended to remember that part, even if she couldn't remember much else about the marriage fondly anymore. The competing salvage claim, the one built on the words undue influence, was withdrawn by Preston's lawyer in the 6th week. Quietly, without a hearing, once it became clear that pursuing it would require Preston to testify under oath about the timeline of his own loan fraud in the same proceeding. His lawyer, in a brief note to Corinne, called it a strategic withdrawal. Corinne called it, privately to me, the sound of a man finally recognizing which fights he could actually survive. I did not celebrate any of it. Everett had never been a man who celebrated another person's collapse, even when that person had earned it thoroughly. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had inherited that particular restraint, along with everything else. What I did, instead, in the 6th week, once the federal review had confirmed what everyone already understood to be true, was drive out to the lake house, the one Preston had once promised his lender as collateral, the one his father built with his own hands after 2 overseas deployments. I stood in the yard for a long while, looking at the water. The house was mine now, formally, folded into the trust along with everything else. Though I had no immediate plans to live in it, I thought, standing there, about all the family gatherings I'd sat through in that same yard over 11 years, always in the same chair, always assumed to be temporary, decorative, a guest at a table she'd apparently never truly been invited to. I was not a guest. I had never been a guest. I understood that now with a clarity that felt less like triumph and more like something settling permanently into place, the way a keel settles once a boat finally finds its proper depth. The final hearing came in the 7th week, not one I sought, one the federal auditor's office required to formally close the loan fraud file and confirm disposition of the brokerage's remaining assets. It was held in a modest federal building in Charleston. Nothing like the small-town courtroom where Judge Whitfield had denied the guardianship petition weeks earlier. This room had the flat, fluorescent hum of a place where paperwork mattered more than performance. Patricia Loomis, the federal auditor, was a compact woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. The kind of person who had clearly spent 30 years listening to men explain away numbers that didn't add up. She read the findings aloud, methodically, without any particular emotion, the way I imagine Everett once delivered difficult reports to men whose careers depended on the outcome. The personal guarantee dated March 14th, she said, bears the signature of Everett Sutton, deceased, executed 4 months after medical documentation confirms the loss of fine motor control sufficient to prevent legible signature. This office finds sufficient evidence of forgery in connection with a federally backed brokerage loan in the amount of $210,000. Preston sat beside a new lawyer, older, more tired-looking than the first one. He said nothing. He had stopped arguing somewhere around the 5th week, Corinne told me, once his own forensic handwriting expert had quietly confirmed what everyone else already knew. Given the deceased status of the named co-signer, Loomis continued, and the recipient's direct financial benefit from the fraudulent guarantee, this office is referring the matter for federal prosecution. under wire fraud statutes, given the loan's electronic processing across state lines. I watched Preston's shoulders drop slightly, not dramatically, just a small settling, like a man finally putting down something he'd been carrying too long to remember what it felt like to stand up straight. "Mr. Sutton," Loomis said, looking at him directly for the first time, "you have the option to cooperate fully with this office's ongoing review, which may be considered favorably by federal prosecutors weighing charges. I'd strongly recommend you take it." "I understand," Preston said. It was the first thing he'd said in the entire hearing. I did not testify that day. I had provided my statement weeks earlier, in writing, through Corinne. I saw no need to stand in that room and watch a man I had once shared 11 years of holiday dinners with absorb the full weight of what he'd built for himself. Some victories don't require an audience. Some are simply true whether or not you stay to watch them land. Afterward, in the hallway outside the hearing room, Preston approached me one last time. Dana was not with him. He looked older than 39 that day, the way men sometimes age suddenly under the specific pressure of consequences they can no longer postpone. "I'm going to lose the boat too," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact, flat and tired. "The brokerage assets get liquidated. I'll be lucky to keep my truck." "I'm sorry to hear that, Preston," I said. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I actually meant it. A small, uncomplicated sorrow, the kind you feel watching anyone's life come apart, even someone who built the collapse with his own hands. "Why aren't you angrier?" he said. "You have every right to be. I called you a freeloader in front of Dad's lawyer. I tried to have you declared incompetent. I forged his signature. Why do you look at me like you're just tired?" I considered the question honestly before answering. It deserved an honest answer. I spent 11 years married to a man who taught me that anger is expensive and rarely buys what you think it will, I said. "I could have spent the last 7 weeks hating you, Preston. I chose to spend them administering a trust your father built, instead, because that felt like a better use of the time I have left. You made your choices. I'm simply not interested in living inside the wreckage of them any longer than I have to." He didn't say anything to that. I think, for the first time since the will reading, he didn't have anything ready to say. "For what it's worth," I added, "because Everett would have wanted me to, the offer of conditional forgiveness is still open, Preston. Not today. Not because you asked for it in a hallway outside a federal hearing. But if you ever become a man who earns it honestly, the door isn't locked. Your father would have wanted that door left open, even now." I left him standing there, in that flat fluorescent hallway. I did not know, walking out, whether he would ever choose to walk back through that door. That part, I understood clearly, had stopped being mine to decide the moment I stopped absorbing what he kept dropping. There was one more gathering that fall, one I had not planned for, one that turned out to matter more than the federal hearing ever could, because it was the moment the entire family, not just Preston, finally understood the shape of what had happened. Everett's sister, Marguerite, hosted a small memorial dinner each year on the anniversary of his commissioning, a tradition going back decades, long before I ever entered the family. She had always invited me, out of politeness more than warmth, and I had always gone, sitting in that same chair nobody thought to move me from. This year, 8 weeks after the flag detail, she asked if I would say a few words. As she put it carefully over the phone, "There's clearly more to Everett's story than any of us understood." I agreed, on one condition: that Preston be invited too. Marguerite's dining room held 12 people that evening, families scattered across 3 generations, most of whom had heard some version of the flag detail story secondhand by then, filtered through Dana or Marguerite or the small-town grapevine that moves faster in Beaufort than anywhere I've lived. Preston came alone, Dana having finally quietly filed for separation 2 weeks earlier. He sat near the far end of the table, smaller somehow, the brokerage gone. A modest apartment replacing the house he'd nearly lost twice over. I stood when Marguerite asked me to. I did not bring notes. Everett never used notes for anything that mattered, and I intended, in this at least, to honor him fully. Everett married me 11 years ago, I said, and for most of those years, I let this family believe whatever it wanted to believe about who I was and what I contributed. I did that because Everett taught me that the truth doesn't need defending nearly as often as people think it does. It simply needs patience. I looked around the table, at faces I'd shared 100 holiday dinners with, most of whom had never once asked me a real question about my own life. I was called a freeloader at my husband's will reading, I said, in front of his lawyer, by his own son, before the folder had even been opened. I said 4 words in response. That's fine, Preston. I want you all to understand why those 4 words were true, and not simply patient. I told them, carefully, without cruelty, about the trust, about the salvage rights, about the logbook, and the name Everett had used for me in briefings for years. A name half his old command apparently knew before his own family did. I did not mention the forged signature, or the federal hearing, or the specific mechanics of Preston's collapse. Some things, once said out loud, cannot be unsaid. I had decided, driving over that evening, that Preston had already paid enough in rooms with fluorescent lighting and auditors reading numbers aloud. This room deserved the truth about Everett. It did not need the full ledger of Preston's ruin laid out for entertainment. My husband spent 30 years training officers to recognize real competence when they saw it, even when it came in a form they didn't expect, I said. He recognized mine. He built a fortress around it, quietly, deliberately, over 14 months, because he knew, better than any of us, exactly how this family tends to treat the people it doesn't bother to truly see. I looked, finally, at Preston. He had not lifted his eyes from the table the entire time I spoke. I'm not telling you this to humiliate anyone, I said. I'm telling you because Everett deserved better than to have his last, careful work misunderstood as an accident or a mistake. And because I think somewhere in this family, someone needed to hear plainly that quiet does not mean empty. It never has. The table was silent for a long moment after I sat down. Marguerite reached over and took my hand, saying nothing, which felt like exactly the right amount of words for that particular moment. It was Preston, unexpectedly, who spoke next. I owe everyone here an apology, he said, his voice rough, unpracticed at this particular kind of honesty. Not for the paperwork. That's between me and the federal government now, and I'll answer for it on my own. He looked up finally, meeting my eyes across the table. I owe Marlene an apology for 11 years of treating her like she was borrowing a seat at this table instead of earning it 50 times over. Dad tried to tell me that more than once. I wasn't listening. I'm listening now. It's a little late, I know. It's not too late for the apology, I said. It might be too late for the trust. Those are different doors, Preston. One of them is still open. He nodded slowly. For the first time since that conference room 3 months earlier, I saw something in his face that looked less like fear and more like the beginning of an actual reckoning, the kind that takes years to finish properly, if it ever finishes at all. I did not forgive him fully that night. Everett had taught me the difference between forgiveness and rescue. I intended to keep them separate for as long as it took Preston to earn the former honestly. But I let the apology stand in the room without correcting it, without softening it, without rushing to reassure him it was fine. It was not fine. It had cost 11 years, a marriage, a business, and very nearly a trust worth more than any of us had understood. But it was, finally, honest. And honest, Everett always said, was the only foundation worth building anything permanent on top of. Ida Delacroix called me 2 weeks after the memorial dinner, her voice warm and a little tentative on the phone, the way people sound when they're not entirely sure an invitation will be welcome. "I hope this isn't forward," she said, "but I've been thinking about you since the flag detail." Warren used to host a small gathering every fall, other Navy widows mostly, women who understand certain things about this life that civilian friends never quite grasp. "I wondered if you'd want to come this year." I hadn't realized, until she asked, how much I had missed the particular company of women who understood grief shaped by service, women who knew what it meant to build a life around deployments and long silences and the specific weight of a folded flag. I said yes before I'd fully thought through my calendar. The gathering was small, 6 women in Ida's modest living room a few streets from the marina. Coffee and pound cake, and the easy, unhurried conversation of people who had all, at some point, learned to wait out a storm without complaint. 2 of the women had known Everett slightly, decades earlier, and spoke of him with the specific fondness reserved for commanding officers who had actually cared about the people under them. He wrote condolence letters himself, one woman told me. A soft-spoken widow named Frances Odom, whose husband had served with Everett briefly in the 90s. Every casualty under his command, every injury serious enough to send a man home. He wrote the letter himself, by hand. Never delegated it to a yeoman the way some officers did. I still have the one he wrote my sister. I hadn't known that about him. 11 years of marriage, and there were still entire rooms in Everett's life I hadn't fully walked through yet. Doors that kept quietly opening even now, more than a year after his death. "He would have been proud of you," Ida said, refilling my coffee without being asked. "What you did, not just receiving the trust. What you did with the truth once you had it. Some widows in your position would have used it like a weapon. You used it more like a level, checking whether the family was actually standing straight." I thought about that description for days afterward. A level, not a weapon. It felt more accurate than anything I'd managed to articulate for myself in the months since the flag detail. I found myself grateful, in a way I hadn't expected, for a room full of women who understood exactly the kind of restraint that particular choice required. Winter came slowly to Beaufort that year, the way it always does in the low country, more a softening of the light than any real cold. I spent most of it settling the trust properly, learning the rhythms of a responsibility I had never expected to carry, meeting quarterly now with Corinne and, occasionally, with a marine surveyor named Holt Ferris, who managed the technical side of the second salvage site's ongoing survey. The second site, it turned out, held more than even Corinne's early estimates suggested. By the time the full survey concluded that December, the combined value of both recovery contracts had climbed past $6 million, a number so far removed from the word freeloader that I sometimes caught myself almost laughing at the distance between them. I did not spend it recklessly. Everett had not built this trust so I could live differently than the woman he married. I kept the same modest house on a side street off Bay Street, the one we'd shared for 11 years, though I did finally have the roof repaired properly. The one Everett had asked my opinion about in his very last logbook entry. I hired the same contractor Everett would have chosen, a careful, unhurried man named Otis Prager, who did the work exactly right because, he told me, the captain always said sloppy work costs twice, once in materials and once in shame. I thought about that phrase for days afterward. Everett's fingerprints were everywhere in this town, in habits and phrases and small acts of care I hadn't fully noticed while he was alive to demonstrate them daily. Losing him had not erased any of it. If anything, it had sharpened my eye for exactly how much of him I'd absorbed without meaning to, the way you absorb a language simply by living inside it long enough. Commander Reyes and I stayed in occasional contact after the flag detail, mostly brief calls around holidays, the kind of relationship that forms between people who witnessed something significant together and feel obligated, gently, to check in on each other afterward. In early spring, he called with a request I hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am, I have a favor to ask, and you're free to say no." "Go ahead, Commander." "There's a young officer under my command," Reyes said. "Lieutenant junior grade, first name Sarah. Came up through a rough background, works twice as hard as anyone else in her unit. Gets talked over constantly in briefings by men half as competent as she is. She reminds me, more than a little, of what Captain Sutton used to say about you before I ever had the chance to meet you myself." "What kind of favor, Commander?" "I'd like to bring her by sometime if you'd permit it. Not for anything formal. I just think she could use 15 minutes with someone who understands firsthand what it costs to be underestimated for years and prove everyone wrong anyway, quietly, without ever needing to raise her voice to do it." I thought about Everett, spreading charts across our kitchen table on Sunday mornings, teaching a woman nobody else thought needed teaching, simply because he recognized something in her worth the investment. "Bring her by, Commander," I said. "Tell her to bring a chart. I'll show her the fastest way I know to read a compass rose." Lieutenant Sarah Voss, no relation to Gerald at the bank as it turned out, came by on a warm afternoon in April. Nervous, in the particular way young people are nervous around someone they've been told matters more than she initially appears to. She was younger than I'd pictured from Reyes's description, maybe 26, with the careful posture of someone who had learned early to take up as little space as possible in rooms full of louder people. "Commander Reyes talks about you like you invented patience," she said, sitting stiffly at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "I didn't invent it," I said. "I just had a very good teacher and 11 years to practice." "Can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Go ahead." "Does it ever stop?" she said. "The feeling that you have to prove something every single time you walk into a room? I've made lieutenant junior grade. I've got the highest evaluation scores in my unit. And men who've been in the Navy half as long as I have still explain basic procedures to me like I just walked in off the street." I made coffee, the same way I'd made it for Dana months earlier, and I sat with her question for a moment before answering. It deserved more than a quick reassurance. "It doesn't stop entirely," I said. "Not because you haven't earned the room, because some people will always need a moment to catch up to what's already true. What changes over time is how much of your own energy you spend waiting for them to catch up. I spent 11 years waiting for this family to notice what I was capable of. I could have spent that same 11 years simply being capable and letting the noticing happen on its own schedule, whenever it happened, if it ever did." "That sounds exhausting," Sarah said. "The waiting is exhausting," I said. "The being capable part, that's just Tuesday. That part gets easier every year if you let it." She laughed at that. A real laugh, some of the stiffness finally leaving her shoulders. We sat at Everett's kitchen table, and I taught her, in an hour, most of what Everett had taught me over 11 patient years, compressed down to the essentials a smart, motivated person actually needs. Before she left, she asked me the question I suspect she'd been building toward the entire visit. "Commander Reyes told me what happened," she said. "At the will reading, and then at the cemetery. Can I ask, honestly, Were you ever tempted to just tell them all right away? The trust, the money, all of it? Instead of waiting for it to come out the way it did? I considered the question the way I'd learned to consider most things that mattered, slowly, without rushing toward the easiest answer. I was tempted, once or twice, I said. Anger makes patience feel like weakness some days. But Everett taught me something I've found true in nearly every part of my life since. If you have to announce your own worth, most people will only half believe you. But if you simply keep doing the work, quietly, competently, for long enough, the truth eventually announces itself. And when it does, nobody gets to argue with it. She wrote that down, carefully, in a small notebook she carried. I recognized, watching her do it, the exact posture Everett used to describe as the mark of someone who would go far. Someone who understood that the smartest people in any room are usually still taking notes. I still think, sometimes, about the word freeloader, turning it over the way I once turned it over that first night after the will reading, testing its weight against everything that came after. It has none left. It hasn't for a long while. But I don't resent Preston for the word anymore either, not really. I understand now that it said far more about what he'd never learned to see than it ever said about me. Dana called me once more that spring, from Charleston, her voice steadier than it had been at any point since the will reading. "I filed the final divorce paperwork last week," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me instead of Marguerite's phone tree. How are you doing, Dana?" "Honestly, better," she said. I could hear, even through the phone, that she meant it. "I got a job at a design firm downtown. The kind of work I gave up when I married Preston, because he thought it was beneath the life we were supposed to be building. Turns out the life we were building wasn't worth nearly what he thought it was." "I'm glad you found something that's yours," I said. "I keep thinking about that dinner," she said. "The one at Marguerite's, where you spoke. I used to believe loyalty meant defending someone no matter what they did. I don't believe that anymore. I think loyalty means telling someone the truth even when they don't want to hear it and letting them decide what to do with it." "Everett would have liked that definition," I said. "He spent 30 years trying to teach it to people who outranked him." "Maybe that's the real inheritance," Dana said. "Not the trust, not the money, just that one idea, passed down to whoever's paying attention." We talked a while longer, easier than we ever had while she was still married to Preston. Two women who had both, in their own ways, learned the exact cost of staying quiet too long in rooms that never deserved their silence. Preston and I speak occasionally now, brief, careful conversations, the beginning of something that might one day resemble an actual relationship, though neither of us rushes it. He lost the brokerage entirely, pled to a reduced charge on the loan fraud in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. He now works, of all things, as a dockhand at the same marina where Everett's boat still sits, freshly maintained, under a new cover I bought myself last spring. He asked for the job himself, Corinne told me, without mentioning any connection to the family, and worked 6 months before his supervisor ever learned whose son he was. I found out, and I let it stand without comment. Some redemptions need to happen quietly, on their own schedule, exactly the way the truth once did for me. Marguerite hosted another dinner that summer, smaller this time, just family, no anniversary occasion attached to it. Preston came again, this time with a woman he'd started seeing, a school teacher named Colette, who worked at the elementary school 2 streets from the marina where he now spent his days. He introduced her carefully, almost formally, watching my reaction the way a man watches for weather he isn't sure how to read yet. "It's nice to meet you, Colette," I said, and meant it plainly, without any hidden edge to the words. Preston relaxed visibly at that, I understood, watching him, that some part of him had still been braced for a version of me that no longer existed, if it ever had. I had spent a year proving, mostly to myself, that accuracy and cruelty were not the same instrument, and that a woman could correct a record without needing to salt the ground underneath it afterward. I established that same spring a small scholarship fund through the trust. Modest at first, $10,000 a year, set aside for the children of enlisted sailors from Everett's old command who needed help covering the cost of a technical certification or a first year of community college. I named it, without much deliberation, the Sutton Watch Fund, after the boat Everett had christened as a private joke between us, a name that had somehow, over the year, stopped feeling private and started feeling like something worth sharing. Corinne handled the paperwork without comment, though she mentioned, filing the final documents, that she'd represented a great many wealthy widows over the years. Precious few of them had chosen to spend their first year of financial security building something for other people's children instead of simply enjoying what they'd been given. Lieutenant Sarah Voss was the first recipient, though not in name, since she'd already completed her commissioning years earlier. Instead, the fund's first check went to her younger brother, a 19-year-old working toward a marine diesel certification in Norfolk, a connection Reyes mentioned almost in passing during one of our holiday calls, and one I acted on the same week without needing to be asked twice. Everett didn't build the trust so I could enjoy it alone, I told her. He built it so the people he actually valued would finally have something solid to stand on. I'm just extending the guest list a little. She smiled at that and said nothing further. I understood, watching her file the paperwork, that some ideas need no further defending once they're finally spoken plainly enough. I thought, more than once that year, about how differently this all might have gone if Everett had simply told me about the trust while he was still alive. Sat me down at that same kitchen table and explained everything in plain language before his stroke ever took the choice away from either of us. Part of me wondered if it would have been easier, fewer surprises, fewer nights alone in a bank room, working through grief and legal paperwork at the same time. But I understood, the longer I sat with it, exactly why he'd chosen silence instead. Everett had spent 30 years teaching men that the truth, delivered too early, before the right moment, can be wasted entirely on people who aren't ready to receive it properly. He wanted Preston to reveal his own character first, honestly, without any interference from a father hovering over the outcome. He wanted me to prove, to myself as much as to anyone else, that I could stand on my own before he handed me the one thing that would let me stand there permanently. It was, in its own quiet way, the most thorough act of trust anyone had ever shown me. He believed I would find the box. He believed I would read the letter correctly. He believed more than anything that I would know exactly what to do with the truth once it finally arrived. He was right about all three. A full year after the will reading, on the anniversary of Everett's death, I drove out to the cemetery alone, early enough that the dew still clung heavy to the grass between the rows of white headstones. I hadn't planned to see anyone there that morning. I simply wanted an hour with my husband, uninterrupted, before the day filled itself with the usual small obligations of a life still being lived. Commander Reyes was already there when I arrived, standing a respectful distance from Everett's headstone, his uniform pressed, his posture as deliberate as it had been the first time I saw him climb those chapel steps. I didn't expect anyone else, I said, walking up beside him. I come by most months, ma'am, he said. Not for ceremony. Just to check in, the way you'd check in on an old commanding officer if he were still around to complain about paperwork. We stood together for a while in comfortable silence. The kind two people share when they both understand exactly what the other one is thinking without needing to say it aloud. "I never properly thanked you," I said eventually, "for what you did that day. You didn't have to say any of it. You could have simply attended the detail, paid your respects, and gone home." Captain Sutton put my name forward for a promotion 3 separate officers actively tried to bury, Reyes said. I owed him a debt I never got to repay while he was alive. Saying the truth out loud, in front of the people who needed to hear it, felt like the closest thing to repayment I was ever going to get the chance to offer. "You did more than repay a debt, Commander. You gave me back 11 years I'd started to wonder if anyone else had actually witnessed." He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the headstone. Simple and white, like all the others in that long, straight row. Everett Sutton, Captain, United States Navy. Beneath it, the dates that framed a life spent teaching people to be quietly excellent. "For what it's worth, ma'am," Reyes said finally, "a salute isn't applause. It's not something you give because a moment feels dramatic enough to deserve one. It's a debt, paid in silence, to someone who earned it and never once asked for the recognition. I gave you that salute because you'd earned it 11 times over, long before I ever knew your name." Something in my chest settled then, fully, in a way it hadn't quite managed to since Everett's death. Not closure exactly. Everett would have found that word too tidy for something as large as a marriage. Something closer to peace. The specific kind that comes from finally being seen completely by someone who took the time to look. I drove home that afternoon along the river road, past the low white houses and the shrimp boats resting easy at the docks. I stopped, as I sometimes did now, at the marina to check on Everett's boat. Preston was there, in his work coveralls, coiling a line with the same careful precision his father used to bring to everything he touched. He looked up when he saw my car. He offered a small, uncertain wave, the kind two people exchange when they're still learning the shape of whatever comes after forgiveness starts, but hasn't finished arriving yet. I waved back. It cost me nothing, and it seemed to mean something to him. Everett had taught me, across 11 careful years, that the cheapest gestures are sometimes the ones that carry the most actual weight. I did not stop to talk. Some conversations are better left to grow slowly, on their own schedule. The way the trust had, the way the truth had, the way almost everything worth having in my life had eventually arrived, quietly, exactly when it was ready and not one moment before. I thought, driving the rest of the way home, about the very first thing Everett ever taught me at that kitchen table, years before any of the rest of it mattered. Close enough to get you home. That's the only standard that matters out there. I had spent 11 years married to a man who measured everything by whether it actually got a person home safely, not by how impressive the journey looked from the outside. I understood that finally, driving past the last stretch of marsh grass before my own street came into view. He had spent his final year making absolutely certain I would always have a way home, regardless of who tried to bar the door. That was the real inheritance, more than the trust, more than the $6 million, more than the nameplate waiting on my porch rail. He had given me a bearing to steer by, long after he was gone to correct my course himself. 242, close enough to get you home. I had been navigating by it ever since. I intended to keep navigating by it for however many years I had left. Whether or not anyone else in this family ever fully understood the chart I was reading. That evening, back at the house on the side street off Bay Street, I sat on the porch rail the way Everett used to, watching the light go long and gold over the rooftops toward the water. I had brought out, finally, from the brass keepsake box that had sat untouched on my dresser for a year, a small nameplate I'd had made that spring. simple block letters etched into worn brass to match the box it had traveled in. It read simply, Sutton. I set it on the porch rail beside me in the last of the evening light. I thought about the folder I had carried into that conference room over a year earlier, unopened, my hands flat and steady on its cover, while a man I had once shared a family with called me something I had never actually been. I never needed the house, or the trust, or the $6 million sitting quietly under my administration, waiting to fund whatever came next. Everett had known that about me before I fully knew it about myself. What I had needed the entire time was simpler than any of it. I needed the truth to stand still, just once, long enough for someone to finally read it correctly. It had, and it did. Everett had made certain of it, quietly, for 14 careful months, long before either his son or I understood what he was truly building. I picked up the nameplate. I turned it once in the fading light, so the letters caught the last of the sun. I set it down again, facing the water, facing the direction Everett used to look every evening, when he thought no one else was watching him remember exactly how far he'd come, and exactly who had come with him. The porch light stayed off that evening. I did not need it. The moon over the marsh gave me enough to see by, and Everett always said that was plenty for a woman who already knew her way home.